Kris is the Executive Director of the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind. She has worked in the offshore wind industry in the U.S. for over 15 years, basically since its inception in this country. Holding senior positions with offshore wind developers, NGOs, and state agencies, she has gained critical insights into the policy and regulations that shape offshore wind activities at the state, regional, and federal levels. Kris has extensive experience working with offshore wind and stakeholders and has expert knowledge of such engagements. And I'm very pleased to have you here today. Kris, the podium is all yours.
Hello, hello. Thanks for having me, guys. Nice to be here in 3D with you today. And thanks to Ray for inviting me. I just brought my notes when I had my call with Ray about this panel. He said, can you cover net carbon neutral goals, offshore wind goals, questions of assumptions of cost, reliability, transmission, decarbonized future, transmission planning, stakeholder engagement, and you have 12 minutes. So let me get into it. Offshore Wind for New Jersey, thanks for having us here. We're the special initiative on offshore wind doing independent public policy analysis to advance the sustainable and responsible development of offshore wind in the US. I wanted to start by giving you a national perspective of what's going on because I'm a Jersey girl myself, and I spend a lot of time just in New Jersey, like in my head, in my person. And so I often forget, and I want to remind us all that this is a huge national goal we have in the US. When we build offshore wind in the ocean, it's actually built in federal waters. So that's controlled by the Department of Interior, and leases are let off the coast. Now, this is kind of an awkward map trying to capture both coasts and Hawaii, but there is enough lease area out there now, leased to private developers, to build 30 gigawatts more, 35 or so gigawatts of offshore wind, beating our national target of 30 gigawatts. Currently, we have 42 megawatts of offshore wind spinning in the US, so we have a lot of work to do, and we're going to talk about some of those challenges. But I wanted to just get a little closer to the New Jersey perspective for you, let you know that we have 2 lease areas here that are let off the coast of the New Jersey. Southern New Jersey, we have the Atlantic Shores area in the north and the Orsted lease area in the south. That could supply just those lease areas alone, 7.5 gigawatts by 2035, which is New Jersey's state goal, the second largest goal to, guess who? New York, of course. We had a 7.5 gigawatt target, and then like 3 weeks later, Cuomo said 9 gigawatts. Like, come on, really? Anyway, we're gonna get there first, I believe. 3.7 gigawatts already awarded, right? So Atlantic Shores and Orsted already have these procurements in place. And when we talk about cost, I wanna mention that in New Jersey, in order to get a procurement award, you need to have what's called a net benefits test, a net economic benefits test, showing that any impact you would have to ratepayers would be made up in economic development to the community. So we're going to talk a little bit about the tremendous opportunity that we have in New Jersey that I see through economic development, environmental benefit, climate change mitigation, and reliable energy here in New Jersey. Every time I turn around, there's another power plant closing. What are we going to do? We're plugging everything in. We're plugging in buildings. We're plugging in cars. You know, I'm plugging this in 4 times a day. How are we getting this electricity? And big challenge, the first one on the slide, I believe, is interconnection and transmission of that electricity. Because if you think about how the grid was designed in New Jersey and at the coast, all of our power goes west to east, right? Power plants in the west, little capillaries out to, you know, your little beach house in Wildwood. It doesn't go the other way. And that's what we're proposing. It's a completely different regime. We're putting power in the ocean and transmitting it from east to west. That's a huge deal. And our friends from NJBIA are here. I believe I saw Janice earlier. And they have a really interesting shared concept proposed. So, you know, stay tuned for more on that. Dan talked earlier about what resources are appropriate for where you are, right? And if you don't have a clean energy resource locally, then you need to build huge transmission lines all over the country that are really hard to permit to deliver that power. I mean, we can't, you know, it's a challenge just to permit a few miles of transmission line. So imagine we're trying to permit power lines coming all the way from the Midwest. The great thing about offshore wind for New Jersey is those lease areas are adjacent to our coastal cities, delivering power where it's needed, locally to where it's needed. Another challenge, stakeholder concerns. People don't know what offshore wind is yet. It's a little sci-fi. It's like Star Wars. They're like, oh, offshore wind? Meanwhile, 35 years ago, the first offshore wind farms were developed in Europe. So this is a founded technology, one we know that works, so it's not Star Wars. But unless you like Star Wars, then it could be like Star Wars. And then the last thing I want to mention and talk more about for a moment are our supply chain constraints. And that's where you at the Business and Industry Association, Ray asked me, how do my members fit in? You fit in because we need to develop the supply chain in New Jersey. This is where the economic benefit comes in that really completes that part of the formula about the net economic benefit, right? So we want to build that supply chain here in New Jersey. We just released a study last week showing $109 billion in economic opportunity by the year 2030. It's a jump ball. We don't know what state is going to get this money, who's going to get this revenue in the door. New Jersey's doing a fantastic job welcoming offshore wind supply chain here in New Jersey. Procurements are increasing over to 2030. So I'm just going to skip through this. I don't want to spend a lot of time. But really, that $109 billion we'll see climbing over time, and that represents foundations, building turbines, transmission cables, et cetera, et cetera. Here's interesting trivia. The first offshore wind transmission power plant, because these are really specialized cables, okay? They're like submarine cables. They're armored. They're huge, right? They're buried under the seabed. The first type of plant that makes those in the country is located in South Carolina. All right. So I wish that was in New Jersey, but they're looking for another facility location, and we would love to have them here in New Jersey. Super interesting. Their first order is an export. Their first order, they are exporting cable to Europe. We can be an exporter of this technology, of this supply chain. That gets me excited, right? We're not just delivering on 30 gigawatts. We're delivering on a truly global supply chain if we're developing it here in the US. Shameless plug for my website, offshorewindpower.org, where you can download a full copy of the report. Ray asked me to talk in my 12 minutes about, am I okay? Yeah. See the clock in the back. Oh, I can actually. All right, the big red clock. Cost of electricity. We can see here, kind of plain black and white, cost of electricity is falling for offshore wind. This is a list of the awards that have been made over the past 8 years or so in offshore wind. You can see the project sizes increasing and the cost of electricity dropping. That's the trend. That's what we've seen in Europe. Here's a little cool chart that shows you, I think it's the red stars that are the US projects, all on a falling trajectory. As we develop the supply chain, we see a 60% drop in the cost of offshore wind in the 5 years in Europe. And that really is to do with the larger turbines we have in the water, right? The fewer turbines you're building, the less cost there's associated with that. We have really matured supply chains that we're bringing over here into the US. And what my goal is to talk to people every day and say, how are we building that offshore wind supply chain here native? Now, that's another fun fact is that my goal every day is to tell one new person about offshore wind. Sometimes that's in ShopRite, and I'm just like literally talking to the person behind me, and I'm like, hey, did you hear about that wind farm? So I feel like today I get credit. I don't know how many people are in here. I get a lot of credit for today. Yes, and virtual people. So this is great. So I also wanted to mention that the economic development benefits of offshore wind aren't just building the turbines themselves, right? It's really the entire ecosystem that surrounds offshore wind. It's the manufacturing facilities, of which we have one of the first in the nation in Paulsboro, and we're going to talk a little more about that. The ports, the vessels that need to be purpose-built. Again, our study demonstrating that $109 billion in economic opportunity is available through that. New Jersey's ports are perfect for offshore wind. They really are. Remember when I showed you that map earlier? about all of the projects located from Massachusetts down to South Carolina, well, guess what? New Jersey is smack dab in the middle of all of that opportunity. So not only will our port supply manufacturing abilities to New Jersey projects, to Ocean Wind, and to Atlantic Shores, but to the entire region. So we have a tremendous opportunity here. I'm excited that New Jersey is capitalizing on it. And I'm excited because we have examples of how the public and private sector are working together to provide a synergy that's greater than the sum of its parts. That really has that opportunity. So the first thing I want to talk about is the private investment in the Port of Paulsboro. A $250 million investment by a company called EEW, and all they do is they roll these huge things, all right? There's a person in that picture, so you can get scale on how big these tubes are. This is a monopile foundation. This is what holds that turbine up in the ocean. And guess what? We've got plenty of great acumen here in New Jersey to build these steel facilities. So this port is, the rendering is on the left. What's going to come out of it is on the right. Construction, it's not just a rendering. If you go to Paulsboro, there is already work on the ground, and I know some of you have seen it. Very exciting. That facility will be open, delivering monopiles for the Ørsted Ocean Wind project, and then beyond that to projects all over the region. And then we look at the public sector investment through the New Jersey Wind Port. $300 million investment by the administration to build a marshaling port that will be the first one in the nation that's purpose-built for offshore wind. Super exciting, a great complement. The Delaware River is alive with offshore wind, my friends, so this is very exciting. I want to leave it there because I think I'm running to the end of my time. I want to leave time for questions, Ray. I had my Jersey speed on. Usually when I'm out of state, I talk much more slowly. That's my cell phone number. I take phone calls and text messages at any time. I don't just do this for a living, I do this for my life. So feel free to contact me anytime, ask me questions about offshore wind, now, later, whatever you need. So let's give it up for offshore wind. Yeah, carb coma. I saw that cheesecake. It looked really good. I didn't have any yet.
Thanks, Kris. You convinced me. I'm sure we have lots of questions. Let me ask you a couple hard ones.
Oh, good.
Again, just from looking at the papers recently, England is going through some difficult times right now, especially in its offshore wind. The production is down. It's causing a lot of energy problems in that part of the world. Is that a problem? Are the lessons being learned there that we could learn from over here? So talk about what's going on in Europe and how it affects New Jersey.
Absolutely. So there are kind of mesoscale weather impacts that affect global circulation of winds. And what Ray is, Ray and I are energy nerds, so you assume that everyone knows what you're talking about.
There are a lot of energy nerds out here too.
All right, good. Yeah. We're among our friends. So recently we've seen production levels fall in Europe for offshore wind over the past 18 months or so. And so two things we do, I think, that really insulate from that. One, we use larger turbines with a larger rotor swept area. This way we can really accumulate winds that are a slower speed. We didn't go a deep dive into the turbines we're using now in the US, but they are an order of magnitude larger and help us capture slower wind speeds. Another thing we do is we give an envelope so that we provide a lower buffer to what the amount of energy we can capture, and we be conservative in those numbers. I think that's only fair to the ratepayer, and that's fair to the technology developers. So those are two solutions that, in the industry we've been discussing. And also, these are really things that are variable. So 10 years ago, there was actually a lot more wind and a lot more energy generated than anticipated, which drove costs down. So really, I think we just need to keep the big picture in mind as we're thinking about developing this resource.
How about questions from the room? I think everyone ate too much at lunch. I will throw out another question for you. Oh, we have one? Okay.
I've got one for you, Ray.
The first one. Hi.
Scott Mackey from NBI.
Hi, Scott.
How are you?
Good.
Do you have a question about Block Island? We've seen a lot of news about that. There's 5 windmills up there that don't seem to be operating this summer. Can you explain what happened there and with the transmission system as well?
I'm so glad you brought that up because, Ray, you said that earlier. I want to just say, they don't mill anything. So let's remember, we call them wind turbines. Just because I love you, Ray, I'm saying that. So they're wind turbines. The wind turbines, 5 turbines on Block Island, this summer were being serviced. The issue is wind speeds are slowest in the summer, except for during hurricane speeds. So it's really the ideal time to service turbines is in the summer. So they were being serviced. They are absolutely operational and functioning. In fact, really saving Block Island's bottom from needing to use diesel generators, which is how they had been generating power for decades. So they now have a native source of electricity that's clean, that's not a diesel generator anymore, and the surplus power goes into the Block Island, it goes into the Rhode Island state grid. So it's really been a fantastic project for Block Island and something that's really strongly supported by the local stakeholders.
So, Kris, you also mentioned that we're now going or needing to transmit energy from east to west versus west versus west to east, and obviously we need to bring that energy through transmission lines up through New Jersey. There's been controversy over some of those siting decisions.
Fair.
There's been some local opposition, and there are some cost concerns. Can you, in the next 4 minutes, can you address all of those issues?
Yes, absolutely. So that's the way the power is transmitted is cables are dug underneath the beach and then delivered to local substations. So right now there are 2 projects, well 3 now, 2 Ørsted projects and 1 Atlantic Shores project. And they are able to use the existing infrastructure that are at those communities. So let me just give you an example. Taking 1,000 megawatts and delivering it to BL England, the retired power plant that's right outside of Ocean City, New Jersey, right? So that's why Ørsted was so interested in building the power plant there and then bringing the cable into Ocean City. You then have a direct line to delivering power where the substation already can be co-located. You're essentially recycling that grid so that it can accept that large injection of power from east to west. The thing is, we're going to run out of those opportunities, which I think you're intimating, right? So we have retired Oyster Creek power plant. That will be another injection point for offshore wind. But over time, those we're going to exhaust that opportunity. And so there's a couple opportunities. One is to build a shared transmission system that can be injected into larger, more stable grid points that are further inland with, fewer cables, which I think also appeals to stakeholders who are using the ocean. We're combining the cables so there's less interaction with those cables in the seabed. And another way is to, just build on that onshore infrastructure. I think in the near term, we're going to need to see kind of a combination of things, right? So the first projects are going in what we call radial cables independently to the beaches, and then over time, working into larger infrastructure projects like Dan talked about, which are more comprehensive and really challenging because, as we know, projects are really thought on a project-by-project basis, and not often enough we're thinking about how we're building whole systems out. And that's what really we need to think about in terms of offshore wind is how are we, and really energy writ large, is how are we transforming the energy supply mix because we have a new way of doing business. And how can offshore wind be a part of that, essentially? I think, and transmission is that huge key. We should do a whole thing on transmission, don't you think?
Next year.
Okay. Ray's going to take a long nap after this.
I can only do this once a year. Any more questions from the audience?
Hopefully you saved me a brownie out there.
I think we saved you several brownies out
Okay.
there, or we'll find them. Kris, thanks
Okay,
for coming.
thank you, Ray. Thank you for the opportunity. I'll be in the back if you want to ask questions.